I wanted to say an interesting idea that, impart to you an interesting idea that I had, which is that in concepts of action, the basic concept, hierarchically, is very wide. Walk, for example, I don't think is the basic concept. It's a nice, tidy, easily perceived thing. I think it's go. I think it's move. From the very beginning, the child sees things that move and then stop and move and then stop. So I think the first thing they would get is motion in place, move, go. And walking would be already understood as a kind of going or moving. And a historical note, I slammed Plato when I said, what do concepts do? And I had the statue of Plato say, do? And some of my academic friends think that concepts do have a function for Plato. For instance, they enable us to know what the right form of political association is because the state should mirror the structure of the forms. Or the structure of the soul, actually, is dictated by the role of forms, and the state should follow the function of the soul. I don't go along with that. I think you can make a case for that, but I think Plato is not concerned with any doing that is related to individual life. Plato is an evil bastard. He really is. He advocated murdering innocent people who disagree with him in more than one place. He set up the first blueprint for a totalitarian state. He opened the door to Christianity. He wasn't as bad as the Christians, but he opened the door for them. So when I see Plato saying, well, the forms are valuable because we can set up the state, yeah, he wants to rule everybody. He actually went to the island of Syracuse in an attempt to become a philosopher king. One of his students was heir to the throne in Syracuse, and the attempt failed, and he had to go back to Athens. So I don't count that as concepts having this worldly function, that you can use them to bamboozle people to put yourself in power as a dictator. I don't count that. So I stand with my attack on Plato. All right, that covers the loose ends, and I want to move on now to some really interesting new material about where we are now that we understand how abstractions from abstractions are formed. We are now able to appreciate this thing called hierarchy. This is the simple slide that illustrates beginnings of a hierarchy. Two triangles are integrated into triangle, two quadrilaterals are integrated into quadrilateral, and then they are integrated into polygon. So what is a hierarchy, if that illustrates it? What is a hierarchy? A hierarchy is an ordered series of elements, like the two elements triangle and polygon, or the two elements quadrilateral and polygon. It's an ordered series of elements in which later ones depend on earlier. And later here is both logical and causal. What is later in a hierarchy comes out of cognitively what came earlier as polygon comes out of triangle. We're going to push this in a minute. All resting on a base that is the starting point, and that is so crucial. That is so crucial. That is the role of axioms in knowledge. That's the role of perception in validating conceptual and logical operations. That is what gets a hierarchy going. That is what philosophers don't realize. That is where they get into hopeless confusion. So in this hierarchy, the base is those figures I've drawn in. It's a perception. The base of the conceptual hierarchy there is the concept triangle and the concept quadrilateral. They form the base for a polygon. Now, actually, you can't call a two-step process a hierarchy. It has to be at least three. There's no need for the concept hierarchy if you've got two steps. It's like you're building a building, but it's one story. There's the ground, which is triangle and quadrilateral, and then there's the roof of the first story, which is polygon. You don't need the concept hierarchy or skyscraper or anything to handle that. Now, I want to look at hierarchy in reverse, and that is not from when we've got it, what it reduces back to, but how we get it. There's this mathematical concept called recursion, which you may know better as looping. That is how almost everything in consciousness works, by a recursive process. Recursion means turning back on itself. Turning back on itself. It's like a snake biting its tail, but in a good way. Not destroying itself, building on itself. Now, the classic example of recursion, which is helpful here, is number. A number is 1 or anything one more than a number. Now, that's not circular because of step A. Once we've said that 1 is a number, then we can use the concept number in the definition in part B. But if you don't have the base is 1, the concept of unit. If you take away that A, and you say a number is anything one more than a number, that's circular. You've smashed the whole hierarchy. But as it is, this is fine, and that's a pattern of all recursive definitions or recursive processes. For instance, a concept, same pattern. A concept is an integration of perceptual concretes or an integration of concepts. We usually say earlier formed concepts to make it clear that there's no circularity, but it's exactly the same as the definition of number. AFA is abstraction from abstractions. It's the source of cognitive hierarchy. And that's why this whole series of lectures is so important. The whole base of everything that has a base is the formation of concepts from the perceptual level and then building recursively on that. All concepts depend on the perceptual level. Wider concepts depend on what they widen from. Yeah, I guess that has to be, right? Narrower concepts depend on what they narrow within. Yeah. But here's what objectivists don't get, and I didn't get until 1990. There are two orders. Look at man, animal, and man, philosopher. I mean the concepts, man and animal, the concept man and philosopher. Now, the temptation is to say, well, the hierarchy is like a skyscraper. Philosopher is the most specific and animal is the widest, so we go philosopher, man, animal. No. There are two orders, the specific to the general and the concrete to the abstract. Specific to general, philosopher is more specific. We go up to man, it's wider. But that's not the hierarchy. That's just the order we use to organize our concepts from narrower to wider. And then Platonist philosopher would be narrower under philosopher. The hierarchy is that number 2, concrete to abstract, where we go down we narrow man to philosopher. So you see in the first order, which is not, I'm not calling a hierarchy at all, I'm just calling it an order, an organizational order. Man is second level, at least in relation to philosopher. In the actual hierarchy, man is first level. And as I refer to philosophers, nth level, because it's not second level. A philosopher is a man who is professionally involved in studying philosophy. He's a scientist in the science of philosophy. Well, try to explain that to a 2-year-old. Right? It's not, you can explain animal. You can explain that man is an animal, maybe to a 3-year-old. To explain what philosophy is, I mean, it's hard to do that with an adult. It's a very complex field or concept that integrates concepts of consciousness with concepts of existential concretes. And it basically concerns the correct relationship between a volitional consciousness and the facts of reality. That's what philosophy is concerned to help you establish, to get your mind in the right relationship to the facts. So that's very abstract. But it certainly isn't second level. It's way beyond the second level. And it isn't before man. So if we now bring in animals, you see the difference between the specific to general order, which goes philosopher, man, animal, up, to concrete to abstract, which starts with man. That's first level. And then goes in 2 directions, independently. So the hierarchy of knowledge, which is what we're concerned with here, is not a simple thing. It's not a skyscraper. In the first presentation of objectivism, knowledge is often likened to a skyscraper where, you can't have the 20th floor while you're denying the ground floor. And there's a very good point to that. But the hierarchy of concepts and the hierarchy of propositions is not linear. It's not like a skyscraper. It's more like a suspension bridge. There are things that are getting narrower and that is more specific and more abstract, as philosopher does for man. There are things that are getting wider and more specific. For example, pet as opposed to animal, as opposed to dog. Pet is wider than dog, but in a way it's more specific than dog. It's certainly more specific than animal. And then you've got these cross-classifications, of which philosopher is one and pet is one. Female. Think of female for animals. It integrates sow, cow. I didn't know it was going to rhyme. What is it? Doe, bitch, hen. We got names for all these female animals from close to the perceptual level, woman for certain of us. Female integrates, widens across all those subdivisions. See what I mean? When you go from man and dog to animal, you take the whole thing in. But female integrates half of the men, half of the dogs, and widens just that. So the hierarchy of concepts is a complex affair with things supported by concepts that are wider than it and supported by, in other cases, by concepts that are narrower than it. It's not a simple up and down. Go out and look at some of the suspension bridges, or look at, in my book, at the picture of the George Washington Bridge, and you'll see that in a suspension bridge, the roadway hangs off the suspended element. The roadway isn't resting directly on the ground. It hangs from these catenary structures that are themselves hanging from the uprights. But the great thing about a suspension bridge is that every element, no matter what it's coming directly from, every element is subject to the law of gravity. Every element is trying to get down, so to speak, to anthropomorphize it. Every structure has to have something holding it up, and it all rests on those pylons that support the main structure that supports the catenary and all the cross struts. So the hierarchy of knowledge, every element depends upon, is hanging off of or pushed up by something prior to it, all resting on the ground, which is, the ground is perceptual reality, yes. I think it's important to realize that the hierarchy of knowledge and of concepts is more like a network of elements than a simple chain. It's rich, it's diffuse. Once you start trying to reduce concepts back to their perceptual base, you encounter this incredible complexity. In a class in 1990 in logic, I tried to reduce the concept farmer back to perceptual reality, back to concepts like man and dog and dirt. And I filled 2 or 3 blackboards. I was able to do it, but there were things, a farmer is a man, okay, good, perceptual, who works on a farm. What's a farm? Well, a farm is an area of ground devoted to raising food, substances, or animals to serve as. Okay, well, what does raising mean? And is food perceptual level? And what do we mean by an area of ground? And what do we mean by ground? And it quickly becomes very complicated, but it can be done. And it's usually not important to do concepts as simple as farmer, even though they're complicated they have many fingers, many ramifications going back to the perceptual level. That's not what we're not fighting to get the right definition of farmer. That's not objectivism's battle. I think it's more power to the people than power to the farmers, isn't it? Or this is the Marxist sewing circle, isn't it? So the moral is abstractness does not equal generality. Abstractness does not equal generality. The conceptual hierarchy concerns abstractness, which is distance from the perceptual level. How many other concepts do you have to go through to get to it, to get to a given concept? There's a very interesting discussion in the appendix to the second edition of Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, where one contemporary philosopher, very analytical-minded, keeps pushing on what's first level and what's second level, and has a number of examples trying to push it, and everything he says is wrong. And Ayn Rand keeps correcting him with what her view actually is, and it's very interesting. And in the end, it comes down to that concept is second level or higher, which cannot be formed without using prior concepts. So there are certain concepts that might seem to be second level or would be second level for some people that don't have to be second level, like animal I discussed last time. Some kind of concept of animal can be formed directly from perception. It's not the biologist's concept of the animal kingdom, which includes clams and sponges and so forth. And it's not even one that would include flies and things that don't look like cows. But a concept wider than any species, let's put it that way, a bigger than species concept can be formed directly from perception, and it doesn't matter. So it comes down to the view, what she said is, it doesn't matter on the very first level. What matters is when you get to high-level abstractions and you steal the concept by denying the base in lower-level concepts. So don't get too fussy about is it first level or second level. The issue is it fifth level while you're denying the second level? And we're going to get into that a little bit in a minute. The other order is not really hierarchy, that's philosopher to man to animal. And last time I gave you that little bit from Our Town, where she's going from the person to the universe, as if that were an address. That's a definitional order. That's an organizational scheme, not the order of learning. The conceptual hierarchy and any real cognitive hierarchy is what has to be learned before what. It's not what's wider than what. It's not how many units are included. It's what knowledge causally depends upon getting and understanding earlier knowledge, like algebra depends upon understanding arithmetic. Arithmetic depends upon understanding number. That's a cognitive hierarchy. It's both logical and causal, because the cause is you can't get there unless you first take this step. Consciousness can't get to the higher level unless it first gets the lower level. Consciousness can't grasp algebra unless it first grasps arithmetic. And it can't grasp, it's like you just can't see it, arithmetic, if you don't know what counting is. The conceptual hierarchy is the one we are concerned with. It's the one where things go wrong, where we need guidance, where we need epistemology. The definitional hierarchy is great. It preserves order. It's psychoepistemologically extremely valuable. I always stress, look for the genus as a means of getting the right question asked. But this great statement by Ayn Rand applies only to conceptual hierarchy and propositional hierarchy, not just any old order. There's an old fable which I read in Russian, she writes. I do not know whether it exists in English. A pig comes upon an oak tree, devours the acorns strewn on the ground, and when his belly is full, starts digging the soil to undercut the oak tree's roots. A bird perched on a high branch upbraids him, saying, "If you could lift your snoot, you would discover that the acorns grow on this tree." So it's just like our goose that lays the golden eggs, but without the fantasy, impossible causation. And I think pigs do go after the roots of trees. I think this, looking for truffles or something that fungi, they do uproot trees by digging too much and undermine them, and the tree falls and they lose out. You can Google it. The epistemological corollary is you can't use concepts that are growing out of some earlier concepts to attack those concepts that it depends on, the later concepts. So this is our first normative implication. Don't do something, or more positively, do something And I just want to pause for a minute to ask, what gives rise to normative implications? What gives rise to the do's and don'ts of cognition? And the first thing we all know about is choice. Where there's no choice, there's no recommendation. You know, don't have a liver. You could say don't eat the liver and the rest, but you know, don't have a kneecap. Don't be subject to the law of gravity. There's nothing you can do about those things, so there's no recommendation, and no science can tell you to either have a liver or don't have a liver. Now, there is surgery today, okay, but let's take it back to where before they had artificial livers or whatever. You get the point. Where there's no choice, there's no recommendation. So choice is one thing that gives rise to normative judgments on the conceptual level. There's no norms for perception. You can't say, well, when you look out there, make sure the light enters your eye. I mean, what are you going to do? Open your eyes, you can say. That's a choice for man. Open your eyes or look here, but what you'll see is automatic. There's no recommendations. There's no science of epistemology for perception. But there's another factor that gives rise to norms in cognition, and that is judgment. This is me, by the way, the second one. Not only that, it's me in the last week, so I think this is right. And it's interesting, so I'm putting it in. It's not orthodox objectivism, but I think it's consistent. What do I mean by judgment? And that's what's really interesting. What does it mean to say, well, in the conceptual realm, you have not only have choice, you make judgments. It means measuring the relative importance of things. Measuring the relative importance of things. When we say a person has good judgment or bad judgment, we're saying he can distinguish what's important from what's not important. You know the old saying, penny wise and pound foolish. A person is very thrifty about pennies, but loose with the pounds, the dollars in American currency. That is getting the hierarchy of importance backwards. Keep it simple. Don't sweat the small stuff. Keep the full context in mind. Know what counts and what doesn't count. That's what good judgment is. It's a measurement of relative importance. And why do we have to have that? Does a bird come to mind? Caw, caw. You can't look at everything. And even to look at a lot of things takes a lot of time. Life is limited and the crow is limited. So you have to go for what's important and spend your mental resources on that before, if there's time, going to what's lesser importance. If we were like Aquinas' angels who had no crow, infinite crow, and could see all the implications of every concept at a glance, then you wouldn't need to have judgment. You just look at the total truth and add up everything. You wouldn't need to add it up. You'd know the sum right away. You just see everything. But because we can't do that, you have to know what to devote your resources to. Now, where does judgment come up in cognition? Because there's judgment in action, too. Like, I should not buy this, I should buy that, because there's too much risk for the reward here, but this is fine. Measuring. But where does it come up in cognition? I came up with two answers to that. Deciding what question to ask next. That doesn't ring a lot of bells, does it? Because this is new material. But the world is very complex. Perhaps that's the wrong way to put it. Maybe that's too anthropomorphic way to put it. Things have many characteristics. So if you're thinking about, say, the last election, consider what you'd have to explain to a 6-year-old to make him understand why you're voting the way you were or didn't vote if you didn't vote. You have to explain what the significance is of the two political philosophies, whether Trump has a political philosophy. We know that Hillary does, and what's wrong with it. Hillary's email scandal, Trump's possible Russian connection, what's wrong with Russia? I mean, it just goes on. And we argued about it on HBL, my email list, for months and months, and people on both sides could point to aspects. The question is, which aspect is important? Which aspect outweighs the other? That's where judgment is required. And people would look at different facts. So one side would say, Trump's a barbarian. He's like a schoolyard bully. Lying Ted, little Marco, really nasty. But then Hillary had her own private server, lied to everyone about the emails that were on her server. She lies all the time. Almost everything she says is a lie, and she's a leftist. So which of those is more important? Or is there something else about Trump or about Hillary that's the real thing to look at? So both sides could point to things that the other side agreed with the evaluation of. It isn't that some of the anti-Trump people said, no, that's fine what Hillary did with the emails. Or that the pro-Trump side was saying, oh, it's good to say little Marco and lying Ted, and it's good to contradict yourself every day. It shows flexibility. No objectivist was, no objective, that nobody disagreed on the answers to the question. The issue was, what is the thing to focus on? So deciding what question to ask next is one issue, and then deciding when the question has been answered. What counts as an answer to the questions? So you've gone back and forth about Trump versus Hillary. You've got evidence on one side, evidence on the other side. When do you decide, okay, now's the time to add it up? And the answer is, that's an issue of weighing evidence. That's an issue of deciding where you are on that scale of possible, likely, certain. That's an issue of judgment in dealing with real world issues. In the world of mathematics, I don't think you need any such judgment. But outside of the realm of mathematics, even in physics, but especially in human affairs and politics, you need judgment to know, where are we on the evidentiary scale? Is this settled? Is this pretty much settled? Is this kind of half settled? Or is this totally up in the air? That takes judgment. Now, relative importance is what we're talking about here under judgment, and that implies a hierarchy of values or a hierarchy of knowledge. Hooray! We have hierarchy of knowledge. We now know what that is. So the first normative injunction, given that we have to judge, is honor the hierarchy of concepts. I chose honor because I wanted something that was positive. My first thought was, don't violate the hierarchy. No, I need something positive. Honor the hierarchy. Then I had identify and hold to the hierarchy of concepts. Now, too many units. And you don't always have to identify the hierarchy. It's not like every time you say, I should brush my teeth. Okay, brush. What does that depend upon? You don't have to do that. It's in cases where there's some reason to think it's confusing that you need to identify the hierarchy. So I came up with honor the hierarchy of concepts. And now we get to the departure, the dishonor of the hierarchy. Floating abstractions don't honor the hierarchy of concept. Floating abstractions are words that people use that have no secure place in the hierarchy. God is love. What the hell do you mean by love if you say something like that? What do you mean by God, for that matter? I think we need to defend liberal democracy. Well, liberal democracy, what do you mean? Oh, you know, where there's laws and voting. That's a floating abstraction. See, when Ayn Rand says she's a radical for capitalism, and people say, what do you mean by capitalism? She gives them a definition, a social system based upon individual rights in which all rights, including property rights, are protected. That's okay, yeah, but what do you mean by rights? A right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. Oh, sure, but what do you mean by freedom? Freedom is the ability to act without being subject to the initiation of physical force. Well, what do you mean by force? This. And that's what she said when she was asked, what do you mean by force? It means this, she said at Fort Hall Forum question period. So that's a good example of non-floating abstractions. And who can do that outside of objectivism? Nobody. Who attempts this outside of objectivism? Nobody. Who would like to be shown such a hierarchy outside of objectivism? Nobody. I'm a little bitter. I may overstate a little. There is that Floyd Jenkins in Wichita, Kansas, who I think would like to hear some of this. But aside from him, the other thing that comes from not honoring the hierarchy is stolen concepts. Stolen concepts. They're concepts that ignore or negate the hierarchy. And there are two categories. In the objectivist literature, it always says ignore or negate. The ones we think of right away are negations, like my brother is an only child. Brother? Or property is theft. Negates the concept of property, which is the basis of the concept of theft. But there are also ones that don't negate, that can even attempt to be positive, like, I can prove the axioms. Proof is a concept that depends upon the prior concept of axioms. The senses are valid. Okay, it's an informal statement, but the senses are the standard of validity. There's nothing to use higher than the senses to say, yeah, the senses pass this test. The senses are the test. Now, I'm going to cover today, in the few minutes that are left, only the floating abstraction ones, because stolen concepts is a big subject that I'm going to cover in a later series of lectures at a future OCON. There are three remedies that I know of for floating abstractions. The best, the simplest, the most fun is concretization. You say you're for liberal democracy. Give me some examples of liberal democracies and things that aren't liberal democracies, so we can see what makes one and what makes one the other. And we kind of come full circle here to the first class where I showed Socrates, what is the one universal justice? That's what Socrates was doing, is trying to get people away from floating abstractions that they were acting on, getting them to concretize it, and distinguishing what they thought fell under the concept from what didn't. So the first and best is concretize. Give me an example. Now, often with objectivists, they have a very thin file for examples, and those are from the novels or from some lecture. You should be able to give lots of examples for your political, economic, moral concepts, which is where we're really focusing here. Of course, the same thing applies to scientific concepts. I'm trying to learn object-oriented programming, and if you ask me, give me an example of inheritance, I couldn't do it. I can't even really give you an example of object. So it does apply in the fields where you're learning, but we're most interested today in philosophic, moral, political, economic concepts, and concretization is so important. Just remember it includes the foil, what isn't an example. Definition. Definition is a process of exhibiting the essential characteristic and its relation to the things in the genus, that is, the things that have the same CCD. So it allows you to quickly reform the concept. That's what a definition does. And reduction, which is the hardest. And pretty much you don't have to do this more than a few steps. So if you ask about liberal democracy, what facts of reality give rise to the need for the term liberal? I don't think you'll come up with any. It's not a valid concept. But capitalism, what facts give rise to the need for capitalism? Life or death. That's what gives rise. You're in the concentration camp being tortured, or you're playing the stock market and making a lot of money. That's a pretty big difference. So reduction, don't try to reduce all the way back to the perceptual level, but if you get a few steps of why this concept is needed, then you won't have a floating abstraction. And just to indicate a vast subject, the remedies for stolen concepts are definition again, and to ask which of these two concepts can you have alone? Property is theft. Could I have the concept theft if I don't know what property is? No. Could I have the concept property if I didn't know what theft is? Sure. So that will tell you which is the prior concept. Those two should suffice to avoid stolen concepts. Okay, I'm going to stop now for questions, and we'll pick up next time with the proposition. Thank you. Yes.
Good morning. I have a quick question. At some point last summer, I heard a podcast where someone brought up the idea of conceptual hierarchy, but this person definitely wasn't into objectivism or Ayn Rand's ideas. And when I checked the person out a little bit, it seemed like they might have been into the ideas of someone like John Rawls or, who do you call him? F.A. Hayek.
But he used the words conceptual hierarchy?
I believe the person did.
If he did, he got it from Ayn Rand. That's good to hear.
He was using it in the context of talking about Locke and Marx and how their ideas built on others. I was hoping you might know, the question was going to be whether or not you thought there were other philosophers who used the idea of either hierarchy or something else in philosophy, differently. Yeah,
there are other philosophers who have observed that Aristotle's the big guy, but even Plato observed that there's an order of dependence, but nobody uses the phrase conceptual hierarchy except objectivists. So if you heard that exact phrase, someone got it from Ayn Rand. It's not, there's no question. No, Google conceptual hierarchy. I don't know this a priori. It's just my anecdotal evidence. But I bet you if you Google conceptual hierarchy, The first 5 hits will be to objectivist material. No, it's the leitmotif of our era that is both ERA and ERROR, is the blindness to hierarchy. Philosophers, those 5 philosophers I put in there, are prime examples of jumping in with a question that's way down the line and ignoring fundamentals. They're like the pig who uproots the tree. So if you're talking about people who are sensitive to there being a hierarchy, that's very rare in today's world, less rare in the preceding world, but it's only Ayn Rand that kind of brings our attention to a laser focus on this, that, hey, it's all about the concepts and they exist in a hierarchy. Hierarchy rests on perception and that it moves in 2 interacting directions. That first quote I read from you, you'd be amazed at how primitive the epistemology is of most philosophers in the 20th century and earlier. They're very clever and very, in the 20th century, very detailed little stuff, but they don't get the big picture at all. They don't have any theory of concept formation. They don't have any theory about hierarchy. They have little games that they play. Now it's getting better. Every time I attack contemporary philosophy, a little voice in my head warns me about my younger colleagues who tell me that things are not as bad as they were in the 60s and 70s, and they are right. So I'm reacting mainly to what went on 50 years ago. It's a little better now. Yes?
I was thinking that you said that Plato disagreed or didn't like people who disagreed with him, and seeing that Aristotle was about 35...
He wanted to kill them.
Well, okay, but seeing that
He wanted the government to kill them, take them out to a re-education camp and retrain them, and if they persisted in denying the principles of morality, i.e. what Plato says the good is, then they should be put to death. That's what he says in the Republic, in a section that the teachers always skip over when they teach it.
I don't disagree with that, but I haven't asked my question yet. I was thinking that
Take him away, yeah.
I was just thinking that Plato might have been really PO'd at Aristotle, his prime student.
What about Aristotle?
Aristotle disagreed with Plato quite a bit, didn't he?
Yeah, but Plato wasn't empowering, and I think Plato really liked Aristotle. And Aristotle had respect for Plato, which
Interesting.
I guess you had to have been there, in the Lyceum.
And you were.
Aristotle, disagreed with Plato. And Plato, Plato, like many of these people, Plato had a different attitude towards the philosopher who would disagree and the average citizen. He was the original elitist, and he thought that the higher type of person would be given more freedom than the average Joe. Like the farmers and tradesmen have zero freedom. The guardians, the secret police, in effect, have a smidgen of freedom, but not much. But the philosopher kings have more freedom than anyone else. So Aristotle, I think he really appreciated Aristotle's criticisms that he raised in the academy. I don't know, maybe he wanted to kill Aristotle if he could, but there's no evidence to support that.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah, I don't have any evidence to support that. What I'm saying literally, rather than saying colorfully he wanted to kill those who disagreed with him, let me be more exact. He advocated as the ideal political system, one in which anyone who disagreed with the ethics laid down by the state would be taken at night by the guardians of the state to a re-education camp where they would be indoctrinated with true morality as Plato saw it. And if they persisted when they got out in being dissidents, then they'd be put to death. So you can apply that to how Plato felt about Aristotle. That's conjecture. But that's what he says in the Republic and in the Laws, Book 10, I believe. Yes, next question.
Oh, thank you for the talk. I'm a high school teacher, and when I'm trying to clarify things or explain things to my students, or even in my own mind, I find that I'm using analogies a lot, but I don't really see that in objectivist literature too much. Is there any thoughts on
You don't see it in the what?
In objectivist literature, talk about analogies specifically.
All the time. Yes, Ayn Rand used analogies all the time. And she would name principles after analogies. There's the Cecil principle, but that was cut out of the fiction writing book. What else can I bring to mind real quickly? It's hard to do this.
I'm sorry, I guess I'm asking it addressed specifically as a tool.
It's
as
good.
Opposed to just used.
An analogy is a temporary concept. It's a concept that's probably not warranted across the board. So if I say to you, an analogy is like a stick used as a hammer when you haven't got a hammer. There, that's an analogy to an analogy. Okay, it's a meta-analogy. I made an analogy. It's a stick used as a hammer when you haven't got a hammer. Now, you don't want to say sticks are hammers. That would be a bad concept, right? They're too different. But they have one thing in common. They have the ability to smack something if you come down with them. Yeah, I need a certain thickness and weight of stick, but you can do that a little bit. An analogy is like that. It's a temporary, it's two things that have one thing in common. The thing you're interested in, the aspect that you're interested in is in common. So since the thing you're analyzing with is simple and understood, it's good to use to explain this. Here's a great analogy that everyone knows, I think. Electric circuits and water flow. There are tremendous analogies between current flow in a circuit and water flowing in a stream or against a dam. So everybody uses that analogy. Now, no one would say water and electricity, yeah, they're the same thing. That would be wrong. But they have this one property or one set of properties in common. And now I use analogies all the time. They're like my bread and butter.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're a good thing. But you have to know when they, like the file folder. Where's my head? The file folder analogy. It's like one of the most important analogies in objectivism, but concepts are not file folders literally. They have a lot in common with file folders. Knowledge is hierarchical like a skyscraper. Okay, as a first approximation, yeah, that's an analogy. And it's limited. And the suspension bridge I gave in this class, that's an analogy. I'm not saying concepts go over rivers with pylons stuck into the bedrock and are made of steel. No, they're like a suspension bridge. Ellen?
Hi, Harry. Thank you for the lecture. You talked the other day about teleological measurement, that you would expand on that. Something's more or less joyful, or you like your shirt better than your SSD drive.
No, the other way around.
I know that. So I wondered if you would take some time and expand on that.
Sure. Teleological measurement is budgeting. It is taking but here's an analogy again. It's taking a fixed amount of wealth, which is the time in your life, and deciding how much am I going to invest here or spend here and how much there. So when you measure the value of person A to you versus person B, you're saying, how much of my life do I want to spend with A versus with B? Now, there is a marginal utility issue here, as I rush to warn you. So if you've spent 2 weeks alone with your wife, and your wife's a higher value than your friend, you still may, at the end of the 2 weeks, rationally want to spend the next hour with your friend, because you have all these hours with your wife, you've satisfied that, you're looking for something a little new, and you haven't seen your friend in a while. So it's relative to the context. But looking across your whole life, is my friend more important than my wife? No, because I want to invest more of my life with my wife than I do with my friend. And infinitely more than I want to spend at the dentist's office. So Ayn Rand says that what the unit of measurement is for teleological measurement, what's more important to what, is time. And time means a portion of your life. Your life is your ultimate value. So the portion of your ultimate value you're going to devote to a thing is a measure of its value to you. And that is all the time, speaking of measuring time, that's all the time we have until tomorrow.